Good morning, everyone. Glad to see you all here this morning. Appreciate you being here. It's a gorgeous day outside. It's a little cool, but the sunshine was great. Trees are starting to bud, all that good stuff. So if you have allergies, my apologies. If you don't have allergies, wasn't it great? But it was really pretty coming in this morning. And it's always a blessing when we can be with God's people, study God's Word together. So appreciate you being here. This is the Ezra and Nehemiah class. This morning, what we'll cover is chapter 1 and chapter 2. On the schedule, you'll notice this is lesson 2, and this is my class. It's not Wes's, so I get to take this one over. What happened is, Wes was supposed to cover this class, and then he came up with some phony baloney story about how he couldn't do it. And then I told him I would be glad to step in and do it for him. And then, lo and behold, he could be here. So I just used that to leverage a favor I needed out of him anyway and went ahead and taught the class for him. So don't worry, I did take advantage of him. In case you were worrying that he got away scot-free, he did not. So when we're looking at the book of Ezra, this is the kind of the timeline of what's going on between Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Where we are at this morning, in particular in the book of Ezra, is really the return. And there's two, as you know, returns from Babylon. This is the one where they come back and they start rebuilding, physical rebuilding. They're rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the wall. Important work, and it is spiritual work, even though it is physical work. And this just happens to be on my mind. It came up in a Bible study over the weekend with a couple people, Wes included, where we talked about how oftentimes we don't think about physical. There was an article we were looking at when we were studying. We talked about the 5 paths, 5 ways to grow spiritually. And the first one was take care of yourself physically. I thought, what an odd choice. But then when you think about it, it makes an awful lot of sense. You have to take care of yourself physically if you're going to meet the moment, whenever those opportunities arise, for you to serve the Lord, whatever that may be. You need to be healthy. You need to be able to take care of yourself. That way you can be around for your children. You can be around to be in service in the kingdom. And for the Israelites, as they're coming back into Judah and to Jerusalem, they need physical dwellings, and they need a place to worship. Coincidentally, it's a whole lot of Wes this morning. Wes also shared something that N.T. Wright had said in an interview that I thought was brilliant. When they're rebuilding the temple, for oftentimes, the Israelites focused too much on the temple. And what N.T. Wright was saying is that the temple was a signpost. It was something that was pointing forward to something much greater in the future. We get to be part of that something greater because God dwells within us. But when you mistake the signpost for the reality, it becomes an idol. I thought that was brilliant. And so oftentimes that's what the Israelites did. They mistook the signpost for the realities. Things that were supposed to be making them look forward to something greater is what they put all of their stock into. As a people, sometimes they overvalued themselves thinking, well, we're God's chosen people. Well, yes, you were, but you were a conduit of something greater. You weren't the end, you were the means to the end. Nevertheless, the means are important. They need to have the city rebuilt. They need to have the temple rebuilt. So that's where we are in this story. So they've been in Babylon now for 70 years, and it is time to go home. So before we get into class, let's have some thoughts, some introductory thoughts. First of all, why is this important to your faith today? Why in the world does something that happened 2,500 years ago, 6,500 miles away, mean something to you? What do you think? Yes, Sergeant. Oh, you've gotten off track in your faith? Man, that's never happened to me. No. I think that's exactly right. I think that all of us at some point get off track, and we need to be restored. We all want restoration. And sometimes that means individually we want to be restored, and sometimes it's as simple as I have my journey of faith, and I've taken a misstep, and I need to make a correction. Sometimes I've never taken the first step. I need to be restored into a relationship with God as He intends. And then collectively, do we ever have that issue collectively where we need to be restored? I think sometimes we have a tendency to make Christianity completely individualistic, and that doesn't really jive with the rest of Scripture. There's an awful lot of times, especially Old Testament times, where they talk about things like collective guilt, where priests will speak on behalf of the collective, speaking to God and making amends or making apologies, professing repentance for the entire nation. And so for us, we need to always bear in mind that we have a collective responsibility to each other and to God. That doesn't mean that we're absolved individually. We have individual responsibility too. But both those things can be true, and they're not contradictory at all. Think about what Romans 8:23 says. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who had the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. The redemption, the restoration of the world, we're a part of that. And we have this first fruits of that. Like we get to look forward because we have this initial taste, this appetizer of what is to come. And so that should make us yearn for it. And what Paul reveals there in Romans is that all of creation yearns for it. When I was teaching the Genesis class with the high schoolers last quarter, that was something that came up a couple times. You think about this. In Genesis, whenever Adam and Eve sin, who gets cursed? Who gets cursed first? The serpent gets cursed first, then Eve, then Adam. But what's included in Adam's curse? The ground. What did the ground do? The ground somehow gets affected by Adam and Eve's sin, and so it gets cursed as well. And then you fast forward to the flood. What got destroyed in the flood? Everything. So again, the earth gets cursed for human beings' sin. And so all of the earth, as Paul is alluding to here in Romans 8, is longing for restoration. And so when you read a story like Ezra and Nehemiah and you see the people coming back at the beginning of this restoration process, that should echo in our minds. That should resonate with us because it's our story. It is a foretaste of what we are also going to be involved in. So this morning in this class, we're going to talk about the decree of Cyrus, and we're going to talk about this new Exodus. It's not the Exodus from Egypt now, it's the Exodus from Babylon. But it's going to have a lot of hallmarks that sound a lot like what happened when Israel left Egypt. So that's sort of the rough outline of the class, sort of introduction of this particular class session. So let's get into that. Let's talk about the decree of Cyrus. Who was Cyrus? Well, first of all, Cyrus is the king of Persia. And I'm going to have this up in 2 slides. Ignore my sloppiness, but this is the first slide. Cyrus, the king of Persia, overthrew Nabonidus, who was the king of Babylon, in 539. So just a few years ago. In 539 BC, LR, you were there. Cyrus issued, and then Cyrus issued this decree, and we look at this in 2 Chronicles, being in chapter 36, verses 22 and 23. It says, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, all of his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up." Anything stand out to you in that passage and what Cyrus says here? And we'll look at a longer version of this decree, by the way, in Ezra chapter 1 in a moment. Anything do you think Cyrus got wrong here? Many years ago, Todd Chandler told me that one of the keys to teaching a good class is to be comfortable with silence. Wait for your answer. What do you think? What was the question? Sorry. The question is there anything that you think that Cyrus got wrong in what he says? Look, his quote begins, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem," etc. Anything seem weird about that to you? Go ahead.
It's just off the top of my head, but it says he's given him all the kingdoms of the earth. Are those kingdoms supposed to be not of the earth?
Yeah, all right, so there's part of it. God's kingdom is beyond all the kingdoms of the earth. But the Lord hasn't really given all the kingdoms of the earth to Cyrus, king of Persia, as if Cyrus, king of Persia, was getting the Lord's favor. So that's part of it. What are you going to say, sir?
Isaiah prophesied this in Isaiah 44 and 45. I'm not remembering where Jeremiah said that.
Yeah, we'll look at where Jeremiah says it here in just a moment. But yeah, there is indication that this is going to happen. Do you think it was Cyrus's job to rebuild the temple? Probably not, right? Yeah.
Well, the Lord gets his plans completed and uses people in the earth, earthly kings, to do exactly what he wants. He hardened the heart of Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
Now people would say, oh, God did that. No, Pharaoh did that. Just as he helped Cyrus to accept what he wanted him to do.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter what it is, God is going to fulfill his purpose. Cyrus doesn't see the big picture in this and
Mhm.
thinks of maybe it's something he did, but he doesn't recognize that the God, the Creator, gets his plans completed through men sometimes. And even when Priscilla was in the New Testament when Paul was preaching, God opened her heart. So we all have the opportunity to open our hearts. It's our choice.
That is excellent and looks a lot like some of my notes. So class may be short now. No, I think that's exactly right. First of all, God uses the ungodly. Cyrus makes the mistake that this is somehow about him. It is not. Cyrus is not getting God's favor. He is not necessarily being smiled upon by God. However, he is going to be used by God. And in a way that is similar and then also dissimilar to how Pharaoh was used by God. You mentioned that Pharaoh had his heart hardened. Cyrus has his spirit stirred up. I can't talk too much about that because I have a slide about that in a moment. But yeah, both of these people are affected by God, used by God in a similar way, but then also a little different. And I think there's also this, and I think this is important for me. Sometimes it looks really bad, right? If you are in captivity in Babylon, even if you're enjoying it, doesn't matter. It doesn't look good for the nation of Israel as a whole. You're in captivity. You're a long way from home. You're slaves. You're stuck here. It looks like everything is going against what God has promised, and yet we can now see on our side of history that things are actually not wrong at all. God has it exactly where he wants it. And that's a great lesson for me, to ignore all the anecdotal evidence. Sometimes I can look around myself and think, this isn't going right. And yet there's so much that I don't have the opportunity to see. I have to have faith and trust in God that he is going to deliver exactly as he wants to deliver. And for us, to just drive this home a little bit more, so often we conflate the ideas of what we think everything should be spiritually and how everything looks politically. Oh, this world's just going downhill. Everybody says that. Every generation says it. Every generation's probably right. It is going downhill. But what we all ignore is God is sovereign and king. This is his creation. He will redeem it. He has promised that he will redeem it. He will restore. He has promised that. Do we doubt that just because it looks bad? We shouldn't. Although I would imagine that some of the Israelites doubted it while they were in captivity in Babylon. I'm sure they probably felt that way. But how it looks isn't always how it is. All right, any other comments on this? Great. You guys are great so far. I'm going to count on that degree of activity as we continue to move forward. So, as it was written there in 2 Chronicles, it says that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah the prophet might be fulfilled. Where does Jeremiah say this? Well, in Jeremiah 25, verses 11 and 12. says, this whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after the 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. So, remember, we've had a change of the guard. It is not Cyrus or Persia who took Israel captive. It was Nebuchadnezzar and it was Babylon. So this has changed. It's not the same people now who are being punished. But those people who took Israel captive, they had a punishment that was awaiting them. Also in Jeremiah 29 and verse 10, it says, for thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. What I thought was interesting here is the way that it's phrased. When 70 years are completed for Babylon. Even though this is the story of Israel, it eventually is our story, we have to remember there's other things going on in the world. And for God, part of this was, I'm going to set Babylon right. Babylon has been cruel. They have been evil. They have damaged God's people. They've hurt God's people, and they've hurt other people as well. And there was a reckoning for Babylon that was all being, coalesces with this punishment for Israel. God can accomplish both those things simultaneously, and he does. I am sure that when Babylon took Israel captive, they felt like they had had a great victory and things were going well. But now, again, on our side of history, we can look and see that actually that was the beginning of the end for Babylon. They had 70 more years, and then God was going to fulfill what he had said to Jeremiah, or through Jeremiah. Any thoughts? Yes?
So I have a silly question. Is this a direct prophecy of time of Ezra?
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is, because when that 70 years is fulfilled, that's where Ezra picks up. So, this is all fulfilled by 539 BC, when Cyrus overtakes Babylon and Persia comes into power, and then the year later is when Israel begins their return to Jerusalem. Any other questions? That's good. All right. So again, I told you I've repeated this. Cyrus, the king of Persia, overthrows Nabonidus in 539, takes control of this widespread kingdom. I'm trying to think where I had this note. I guess I had it not in anywhere. No, wait. Nope, I'm going to get ahead of myself. Sorry, don't want to do that yet. All right, so let's read from Ezra chapter 1. We'll go ahead and read verses 1 through 4. It says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord may be fulfilled by the word, let me rephrase that again. That the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. There are some really important keys, by the way, in the way that Cyrus words that. Let's finish this out. And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. What was it that was different about how Nebuchadnezzar treated the countries or the nations that they overtook versus how Persia treated the nations they overtook? There was something fundamental in how they wanted to treat those nations that's different. What is that? Yeah.
King Cyrus wanted to be known for a person who promoted religious freedom and to allow the people to kind of maintain their culture a bit, and he gave and Nebuchadnezzar took away.
Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar just was going to take, and Nebuchadnezzar plundered the house. He plundered the temple. He wanted to destroy the religions of the countries that he overtook. Cyrus and Persia had a different approach. The way that they approached it was, as you said, religious freedom. And it allowed them to have their culture. Do you think Cyrus did this because he was just such a better person than Nebuchadnezzar?
He wanted to be known as that type of person, open and accepting.
Yeah,
Reputation.
why would a leader like that want that kind of reputation?
Well, the reason that he did it, so he thought if he let all the other gods be blessed or be used in because of the cast net of, allowing other gods, that he would be blessed from those gods as well.
Yeah, Brittany, and then over here. Same thing? Okay. Who had a hand up over here? Were somebody? Loyalty? Yeah. Think about this. What causes a rebellion? Oppression. So if I allow you religious freedom, you lose a motivation for rebellion. Right? So if I allow you to continue to have your culture, continue to have your God, then you lose some motivation to rise up against me. And then, like Ryan was referring to, this is the Cyrus cylinder, which I know you saw in the first class if you were in here. Part of what it says, or part of what Cyrus said here is this. At the command of Marduk, great god of Babylon, I restored the gods taken by Nabonidus. May all the gods whom I have resettled in their former sanctuaries intercede daily on my behalf to Marduk. Oh man, isn't it great to have lots of gods all rooting for you? For Cyrus, this is strategy. This isn't because he's such a better person. He's not a great person. He's still a marauding leader of a nation. But he's smart enough to think, I'm going to take away this motivation for rebellion, then also I'm going to get everyone else's gods to work on my behalf, to talk to my God, so I can continue to be blessed and I can continue to dominate these other nations. And everything in his history says this is working out really well for me. So when we see that, there is a difference between how Babylon approached it and how Persia approached it. Do you think God preferred one over the other? Would you prefer one over the other? I think I definitely would, right? I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But one just tries to eliminate God completely. The other one tries to allow God to survive or to remain in a cacophony of other gods. Like there can be several gods and he can just be one of them. Which one gives God the glory he deserves? Neither. So while one may be a little preferential, especially for the people, neither one of them gives God his due. And that is problematic. What do we learn about the faithfulness of God in what we have read so far? Go ahead, Darryl. Yeah, so for one, God used both. Doesn't matter if one was more evil or less evil, doesn't matter. God used them both to fulfill the promises that he had made, or, in this case, the threat of punishment that he had made. He told Israel this is what was going to happen, this is what happened. He told them how long it was going to last, that's how long it lasted, and it all had to do with these people. So God remains in control through all of this, and God remains faithful through all of this. What does that mean to you? Go ahead, John.
That he keeps his promises.
That he keeps his promise. What promises has God made to us?
Well, for us, I look at it as the promise of eternal life through Christ, as that's the culmination of his plan.
All right, so we have the promise of eternal life through Christ. And now we can read this story and countless others and know that God means it, that promise will be kept. And again, it doesn't matter what it looks like, doesn't matter who's in control, doesn't matter if we're in a nation with freedoms or if we're in a nation under oppression. God rules. God's faithfulness is undoubtable. Also, God's threats of punishment cannot be doubted. So we have to bear both in mind. Hopefully, everybody in this room is a Christian. Hopefully, everyone in this room is looking forward to the great and precious promises. But if we're not, then we can also know that it doesn't matter how it looks. If God has threatened punishment, he will deliver that as well. All right, let's keep going. I told you I had a slide about this, comparing Pharaoh's heart and Cyrus's spirit. First of all, this is interesting, and I thank Eric for bringing this to my attention in a Bible study a few weeks ago. But when Pharaoh's heart was hardened, that word there, kabod, means to be heavy, to be hard, to be honorable, but it also means to be heavy with glory. What is it that Pharaoh wanted? He wanted glory over God. And the more and more that he wanted it, the harder, the heavier his heart became. We read it and we think that his heart became impenetrable, that it would no longer accept, rebuke. It wouldn't listen to reason. And in a sense, that's true, but the reason it does that is because it has become so proud. It is seeking glory. Now, is that different than Cyrus? Yeah, as Cyrus says, his spirit was stirred. And so that is something that's inside of him that is stirred up. But both of these things that happened to them, Pharaoh's heart being hardened, Cyrus's spirit being stirred, those are already their characters. Pharaoh was already a very proud individual. He was already someone who wanted glory over everyone else. He thought himself a god. He didn't want any other gods in his territory. Cyrus was already someone who had this strategy of using religious freedom as a means to an end. And so nothing changed in them. It was just augmented. God allowed it to be exacerbated in a sense. But really, both these men are moving selfishly. Pharaoh for his own good, Cyrus for his own good. There's really nothing redeemable about either one of them. Well, I don't want to say redeemable. That's a poor choice of words. There's nothing admirable about either one of them. They're both after their own. They just take different ways to get it there. Any other thoughts on the first 4 verses? Obviously, teaching in the auditorium, it's like being a sprinkler head on the lawn. You got to do this whole, thing. It's good for the back. All right. Let's keep going. In Ezra chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. Let me back up. Thus rose up the heads of the fathers of the houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred up to go to rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. And all who were with them aided them with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, and with costly wares. Besides all that was freely offered. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithridath, the treasurer, and counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the number of them: 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, 1,000 other vessels. And all the vessels of gold and silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought up from Babylon to Jerusalem. So here, the Israelites leave with 5,400 vessels, different types, silver, gold, all of this stuff. When we see this, look at what it says later in verse 15. Take these vessels, go and put them in the temple that is in Jerusalem. Let the house of God be rebuilt on its site. Where had much of this gold and silver come from? From the temple, right? It was taken from Israel. It was given back to Israel. So this is restoration. This is not just free will goodness of Cyrus. Again, it's strategic. He's giving back what was taken from them in the first place. He's also encouraging others to do the same. Clicking. In Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 and 36, let's jump over there and read that just real quick, because it does connect. It says, the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. The Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so they let them have all they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. You'll notice that the title of these slides is Plundering Persia. It doesn't look the same as what happened in Egypt. Right? In Egypt, it's almost like God intervened and the people asked for it, and they were like, yeah, just take it. What had already occurred by the time that Israel was leaving Egypt? I'll give you a hint. What 10 things had occurred by that time? The plagues. So I've always had this vision as Israel's leaving. They're like, take whatever you want and get out. Just leave, take you, your God, and your plagues with you. Leave us alone. This has been horrific. That's not the case here in Babylon, but still, as they leave, you see this parallel with the Exodus from Egypt, as they still end up getting gold and silver. When they left Egypt, they left with gold and with silver. They got assistance. And the gold and the silver that they got when they left Egypt is what they used in the tabernacle. What they're getting now is what they're going to use in what? In the temple. So again, you see these parallels as they're leaving. When we think about remnant, we always think about people. Yet with God here, you see that the remnant is more than just people. I think people are clearly and obviously the most important part. But God's being even more inclusive than that. The remnant includes those things that were in the temple of God, that silver and that gold that belongs to God. And it includes everything they will need to restore worship. When God restores, He restores completely and abundantly. And that's a tremendous blessing. That is a tremendous hope for us. This world's not my home, all right? I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. So when we leave, when we're in this world and we're dealing with pain and with sickness and death, and maybe you're dealing with poverty, or you're dealing with anything that is an oppression and a part of this broken world, and you think, man, sometimes this is just miserable. We can look forward and know that the restoration will be incredible, and it will be complete. Can you think of an example of God restoring when someone had lost seemingly everything? Job. Does Job get back exactly what he had lost? What does he get back? That and more. Come on. What a blessing. When Israel leaves Egypt, they leave with more than they came with. More people, more gold, more silver. When Israel leaves Babylon, they leave with more gold and silver. Again, we're putting it in the temple. We're building it up. Some of the people stay, so maybe this analogy just fell apart a little bit. But anyway, restoration is complete and then some. And for us, when we're looking forward to our restoration and the restoration of all things and the redemption of our bodies and the resurrection of the dead, we can anticipate much more than we can imagine. However that works, it's going to be better than you think. I don't care how great you think. Yeah, I just said that. All right. Why would anyone remain in exile? What do you think?
They made families, friends, they had a life there.
Yeah.
It was easier just to stay and blend in.
Exile's really not so bad, right? I mean, it's really not. If Cyrus is allowing you to worship if you want to worship, and you're not, they're not being made to make bricks without straw. This is different. This is okay. They're being assimilated into a culture that's not theirs, and they don't think it's that bad. What are you going to say?
And anyone under 70, that's where they were born. That would have been their home. So to go back to somewhere you've never even seen would seem silly to some of them.
Yeah, right. Why would we want to go back? And think about what's ahead of you if you go back. Hard work, rebuilding. That's not for the faint of heart. When you go back, we're going to have to work really hard to restore all of the buildings, to rebuild the wall, to rebuild the temple, and to rebuild our culture and our worship and our religion. That's hard work. So yeah, I think there's a part of it. If anyone under 70 was born there, they lived there, it's all they've ever known. It's very comfortable. Does that parallel with us sometimes? Do you remember being in heaven? How great that was? Wasn't that great? I don't remember that either. Right? And yet I'm looking forward to an eternity with God. What was it like when we walked in the Garden of Eden with God? Do you remember that? Wasn't that great? I don't remember that either. And now I'm being asked to look forward and to put my hope in that. And that's difficult. So I do think there's definitely a part of it. All right. I need to speed up a lot. All right. In chapter 2, the good news is we're not reading in chapter 2. There's an awful lot. There's a list of people who are returning. Why is there a list? You ever wonder why that is? Why is there a list? Why don't you just say that many of the people of God returned to Jerusalem? What's important about that list? Heritage. It says they returned to Jerusalem and to Judah, each to his own town. We can match that up. Historically, we're going to be able to see you left here, you're going back there. Right? So there is, again, this idea of restoration. Things are going to be made the way that they were. It reinforces this idea of God restoring. It also gives legitimacy to those who are rebuilding. The people who are rebuilding, there could be an influence of Babylon. We could make this like New Babylon. As we return back to Jerusalem, let's take all the stuff that we learned in Babylon that was great, that we really liked, and just make that part of our culture. Wouldn't that be cool? We could do that. That can't be allowed. This has to be done right. It has to be done purely. When we go through the list of people who are returning in this first part of the Exodus, it starts with the leaders, but then it just starts with a group that I'm going to call the laity. Then the Levites, then the temple servants, Solomon's servants. You think there's anything significant about that list and the order that list is in? When Jesus' apostles, particularly two, asked to sit on Jesus' right hand and left hand, what was a lesson that Jesus drove home to them? The greatest among you will be the servant. Why were the Levites not listed first? They were servants. Right? The people are put ahead of the Levites. The servants are last on this list. The Levites are not the ones who are the focus. Right? They're later in the list. I just think there is a first should be last, last should be first part to this. Those servants who are the Levites who are serving God are put right kind of in the middle. After the leaders. Leaders make sense because this is a journey, and they do have to lead. So that makes sense. But the laity coming second, and then the Levites coming third. To me, that there's something purposeful about that. Also within this list, and you might have noticed, blah, 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 reset all of that. That was terrible. You might have noticed when you read this, the names Mordecai and Nehemiah, and thought, ooh, not the same Mordecai and Nehemiah. I was totally let down by that. So if you were let down by that, me too. Those were just little common names. So it's not the Mordecai we read about in Esther. It's not the Nehemiah we're going to read about in the next book. It's just sort of a common name. What stands out on this list? You don't have time. Sorry. I don't have time for you to answer that question. I hope it's important to you, but I got to move. Were the people who returned wealthy? Were they wealthy? And how would you know?
They brought all those goods with them.
Yeah, look. 7,337 male and female servants. How many male and female servants do you have? I don't have any. That's not true. I have 2 teenagers. 200 male and female singers. Horses, mules, camels, donkeys. They were wealthy. Why did that matter? Why does it matter that the first group that comes back, that they're wealthy?
It's going to take a lot of money to get going.
Yeah, I think what they're doing is going to be costly. It's going to take a lot of money. They got to buy a lot of materials. They're going to need some help. There's also a really interesting section here in chapter 2, really starts in verse 36, where it talks about these religious leaders who cannot prove their ancestry. Why is that section in there? Why does it matter that that's addressed? Yes, their credibility is important. This has to be done right. And there is a commitment on the part of leadership to make sure that it's done right. So if you can't prove that you're part of the religious leadership by your heritage, I'm sorry, stand aside. We can't risk it, is the idea. So those people are forbidden from eating ceremonial food even until, and I never say these words right, the Urim and the Thummim, I don't know, are consulted. What were those, by the way? What's he referring to? Oh, come on. Y'all know Bible history better than that. Matt Finley knows. He's waiting to see if anyone else can answer. He's just shaking his head. He knows. Those were the means by which they determined God's will. Sort of like casting lots. They would consult the Urim and the Thummim to determine what God wanted them to do. So for all these people who are sort of on standby as religious leaders, you can't prove your heritage. Maybe you've intermarried, maybe something has been lost, but you can't prove your heritage. We're going to wait until we can consult essentially with God to determine whether or not you can be part of this. All right, big picture lessons. This is what I was trying to make sure that we got to with a few minutes left. There's a commitment to restoration. It's something I want you to take away from this. On the part of God, on the part of the people, there's commitment to restoration. And so for us, that's incredibly important. We have to be committed to not only holding together what we have as God's people, but to restoring God's glory as best we can. We have to work within that. What are some examples of God's commitment to restoration that you see here? Right.
He's setting a wrong, he's righting a wrong, and putting them in the land that he had originally planned for them to be for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and not only are they returning to the land that they are supposed to be in, but it even goes as specific as to say each one to his own town. Like, it's been 70 years. You're going back to your hometown. It is restoring the promise. This was the promised land. It will not fade because you have failed. The promise remains, right? So you still get to that. What are the examples? You think about God's commitment. Outside of this book even, can you think of some examples that prove God's faithfulness?
Restoration of the law.
Oh, the restoration of the law. Man, that's a good one. I wouldn't have thought of that one. Yes. Why does that prove God's commitment to his people and his faithfulness?
I don't know how much they practiced the Lord's law when they were in captivity, but some of it had to have faded away. And they really made a big deal of writing it down, restoring it, making sure the kings, when they came into place, knew it so the people could be instructed constantly in it.
Yes, so much of Ezra and Nehemiah is let's learn from our mistakes. And part of the mistakes where you have let parts of the law go before you went into captivity, obviously what you allowed to happen to God's temple, but then also while you were in captivity, things have faded. Those need to be restored and strengthened, and we need to have a commitment to make sure this doesn't happen again. So to learn from their mistakes. All right, one more thing. I'm almost out of time. God's perfect timing. There are things here that were needed to align. Whether it's Nebuchadnezzar being in power, Nabonidus taking over after him, Cyrus taking over and defeating Nabonidus. Things that had to align in history for all this to work out to fulfill God's plan. And isn't it odd that it worked out perfectly? It's not odd. It is God's pattern. This is what he does. God's timing is always perfect, and that's so important for me because I get impatient, and I get worried, and I get anxious, and I read stories like this and trust in God and his timing. Thank you so much. Great comments and participation. I appreciate it this morning. Thank you very much.